Welcome to another episode of The State of Sustainability. I'm your host, Saif Hameed. In this episode, we're going to talk about green jobs in 2026, where to go, what to look for, how to think. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. There are a few reasons why I thought this would be an interesting topic. Honestly, I think this will frequently be a topic to talk about. And I've been sort of easing it into my conversations and my events over the course of last year because I noticed that more and more sustainability functions are seeing attrition, job losses, reductions, downsizing, restructures, whatever you want to call it. There are a million names that people use when they talk about people being let go. And unfortunately, I first started observing this happening in a meaningful way 2 years ago, I would say. And I saw it accelerate a little steadily sort of over last year, and I'm kind of seeing it continue into this year as well. And I have sort of been having these coffee conversations with people who were impacted by this, and very often they say that they'd love to sort of get my thoughts on the job market, on where to look, on which companies might be interesting, which sectors might be interesting for them to look for new opportunities. And so I thought actually, rather than just keeping this in the sort of realm of one-to-one conversations in cafes around London and elsewhere, let's actually just do a podcast episode on it. So I wanted to cover a few bases in this episode. One is I wanted to talk about where I think the sustainability function is heading. And then I kind of want to talk about how do you actually navigate that, and then where do you look, and so on. So if we start off with on where the sustainability function is heading, I had this really bizarre kind of eye-opening moment a few months ago. We were hosting the State of Sustainability Summit, which for those of you who've attended our summits are our sort of flagship event where we bring together all the companies in our kind of network, typically food and bev, but generally now it's expanding a little around the other consumer sectors. And we sort of bring together around 50, 60 sustainability professionals. It's very exclusive, just sustainability professionals in operating businesses, no vendors or consultants or anything. And we have like a full day of candid conversations around very deep, interesting themes. We do this in London, we do this in Chicago, and this year we're also doing it in Amsterdam. We'll put the details in the show notes for anyone who wants to join us this year. But at this event, I typically do like this, keynote, and I kind of talk about the state of sustainability over the next year, whatever. And I had this question, which I asked to the audience, and bear in mind that this is the largest food and beverage companies that you could think of. All the usual names, I can't name them myself because of Chatham House rule. I'm sworn to secrecy. But I sort of said, how many of you think that the sustainability function is going to be around in 5 years' time? And out of a room of about 60, I had 4 or 5 hands go up. And this is a room of 60 sustainability professionals, of which therefore around 55 people, around 90% of the room is basically saying, we actually don't think our function is going to be around in 5 years. Now, for those of you who have been longtime listeners of the podcast, I'm sure there are a few of you out there who have been listening to us for the last 3 years. You will remember that we've been talking for a while about how sustainability is a transformation function. It is not a long-term thing. If it's a long-term thing, we've all failed. Every corporation has failed, right? This is a function that is spun up to navigate a moment of transition. And by a moment, I don't mean a minute. I mean, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, whatever, however long it takes, a transition for corporations. And it's similar in many ways to like the digital transformation that happened several years ago for many businesses, the data transformation, now the AI transformation that's happening where businesses spin up these functions because they're faced with a new challenge, or they say, great, we want to move now from where we were to where we think we're going. And so actually the fact that most of these teams now recognize that actually this function is doing important work, but that work may not sit within this function in 5 years, I see that as quite consistent with at least how I was seeing the world a few years ago. But that said, I was still surprised. What surprised me was the magnitude of that percentage. And again, these are the biggest food and beverage companies in the world. And what surprised me was that they recognized it themselves, because I think we all tend to have some Like we kind of assume that what we're doing is not only valuable, but has longevity to it. You don't just assume innately that your function is going to cease to exist. And actually everyone assumes the same thing at the same time, right? That's a bit weird. So that was strange for me. When we dug in a little deeper, and this is kind of where I'm getting to where I think the sustainability function is heading, the consensus seems to be that this function is going to be partitioned. We're going to see more and more sustainability roles, responsibilities moving into procurement and supply chain. We've been talking about that in this podcast. It's not going to be news to many of our listeners. It's already happening in pretty large scale, I would say. And I think Unilever was one of the early companies to basically just say, well, we're moving almost all of the actual work and sustainability under procurement and supply chain. But around the time that they started doing that just a couple of years ago, most other businesses were doing that also. There's probably a piece of sustainability, the reporting side, that will most likely move towards finance, and that's already happening, has been happening for a couple of years. Which all goes to say, if you're a person, a professional in that function, like, what does that mean for you, right? If your function is actually going to be absorbed somewhere else, where do you go? I think the best way to think about this, I don't know if any of you have come across Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who's what's the best way to describe him? He's like a thinker on the subject of probability. You may well have come across his expression of the black swan, like a black swan event, which is, a black swan event per Nicholas Nassim Taleb is an event which I'm going to forget what the 3 rules are, but one is that it's a big event. It has a big impact on people. The second is that it is really difficult to predict because it's at the extreme end of the bell curve. If you think of a bell curve, bell curve is all the things that could happen, let's say, and we typically always focus on the hump of the bell curve. This is the most likely set of things that could happen. The most likely set of things that could happen is that the sun rises tomorrow. It's risen every day, right? Like for every turkey, like Thanksgiving is a nice day of celebration until it isn't, right? Like this is about the big hump of the bell curve, not the tail ends, and the black swans happen at the tail ends. And then the third thing is that once it's happened, it's very easily explainable in hindsight. And so a good example that Nicholas Taleb talks about, I think he actually does talk about the turkey and Thanksgiving, but he also talks about the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, for instance, as like a black swan event, and many other market crashes can be black swan events. Anyway, one of the things that he talks about, which I found quite interesting, is the concept of anti-fragility. So he says, we tend to think about fragile and robust. We tend to think about how if you're fragile, if a vase is fragile, it's broken easily. And we say, okay, fine, what's the opposite of that? Well, the opposite is if I drop this vase and it doesn't break, it's robust. Whereas actually the opposite of fragile is anti-fragile, which means that it gets better under pressure, gets better under tension. It doesn't just survive, it actually improves under tension. That's anti-fragile. And so, anyone who's been listening to me for a while knows that I take a long time to get to the point. But to get to the point is, I think that what sustainability professionals should be looking to do in this market is to be not just resilient or robust, but to be anti-fragile. And the reason I say that is because the world is getting actually much more complicated. The world is getting much more risky, much less certain. For those of you following the doomsday clock, I don't know what the doomsday clock says now, but like we're closer to the end of the world than we ever have been, right? I mean, if you just look at the number of things facing businesses that could cause significant business disruption, the list just keeps going on. And as sustainability professionals, we are in the business of trying to make business resilient and robust and so on. And so if we can harness skills and capabilities that mean that actually whenever a crisis comes, we're able to lean in, we're able to help those problems, we're able to actually help businesses navigate those because we actually thrive in those environments, we're able to navigate those environments really well, then I think we're more than just robust, we're anti-fragile. And so my advice to all sustainability professionals, and I'm going to make this a little more actionable, don't worry, is I would actually think about what are skills that are not just transferable, but what are skills that are going to be really good in a crisis? So you want someone who is able to navigate complex data landscapes for sure, right? It's not just that you've been figuring out emissions reporting and carbon inventories, but you actually know how to generate insights from data. You know how to clean data. You know how to ignore data when data needs to be ignored. You know how to structure systems. You know how to generate insights and make observations. If you could have done this really well in supply chains 2 years ago for sustainability and climate purposes, then you could have done this really well for tariffs when the Trump tariffs came out. And in fact, many sustainability teams that I saw in businesses were charged with taking care of figuring out what tariff implications would be for the business, because that was the team that you thought of when you thought of a risk in supply chain problem. And so I think that this sort of realm of can you figure out data? Can you figure out insights? Can you navigate difficult stakeholder situations? Can you corral the business behind something? Can you run workshops, engagement? These sorts of skills, the more that you can make them hard, and by hard, I mean their tangible outcomes are linked to your performance of these skills. There are things you can point to that you've done and delivered operationally. I think you'll find that you will always have a place, even in a tough job market, because everyone needs a good set of hands in a crisis. That said, let me move on to how I think about where to look for green jobs in 2026. But before we get to that, here's a word from our sponsor. This podcast is brought to you by Altruistic. Sustainability teams have one thing in common. They all have messy data sitting in silos across the business. This means 60% or more of their time is spent getting data into shape and not making sense of that data or using it to drive action. Altruistic's AI-based tools can help. Meet Evie, your in-house, always-on-call sustainability assistant. Evie works alongside you and your teams to clean up and transform your enterprise data into usable emissions calculations. Even better, Evie helps you interrogate this data, working like the junior analyst you wish you had. AI alone won't solve all your problems, but data transformation is one you can cross off your list. Visit altruistic.com to find out more. That's altruistic with a Q. I've been thinking about this for a few years because people have been asking me this sort of question for a few years. And so I tend to think in three buckets of green jobs. One is I think about corporates, and that's the sector that I think about the most because I work with corporates and I engage with corporates most often. So large businesses making things, selling things, buying things, etc. And then I think about vendors, which is, let's say, people like me, basically, right? The scum of the earth working in software and consulting and inset sales and offset sales and satellite imagery sales. It basically people try to flog you something. And then the third set I think about are the non-profits, the sort of the thing between, the fluid between all of these different organizations that tries to bring everyone together and move everyone in sync towards action. And so I think of these sort of three clusters. And the reason I think about them is because most people I know who are working in sustainability work in one of these three spaces. And so in the corporate space, I find that a general rule of thumb, if you are looking to have longevity in your next green job, is to follow the margin. And what I mean by that is look for a business that makes good margins. I actually think this is probably more important than looking for a business purely based on how compelling its strategy seems to you. And the reason I say that is because if the business has good margins, then a few things will be true. It will have good brand equity, which means that its brand will most likely be worth something. There are very few businesses with great margins that don't have high brand equity, which means that they have something to lose from getting sustainability wrong from an optics perspective. One of the reasons that Oatly puts so much effort into sustainability is actually the same reason that Coca-Cola puts so much effort into sustainability, which is there's massive brand value at stake. It's big for Oatly because brand is such a big part of the value prop of Oatly, and it's big for Coke actually for similar reasons. So I would kind of think, well, if you're a commodity player and actually what you're selling, will tend to have low margins as most commodities do, you also don't have that same brand equity at stake. You'll also have various other sources of value, most likely that are driving that margin, and those value drivers may be at risk. Maybe you're actually sitting on a really powerful supply chain that you've set up and created, and that's like a real value prop for you. I look at companies like, let's say, Givaudan and Symrise and DSM Firmenich and all these sort of companies that play in this fragrance and flavors and colorant space, and I kind of think there's a lot of R&D there. There's a complex supply chain there. The margins are typically pretty high. I think these are businesses where, therefore, there's a lot of value at stake, and sustainability needs to be right. Otherwise, some of that value goes off the table, whether that's from a customer perspective or whether that's from a supply chain and resilience perspective. If there's high margin, the company is typically bringing together good skills. They will value good expertise. They will value getting that expertise to work well with other teams also. And perhaps most importantly, they will most likely have free cash flow. They will most likely have budgets and the ability to spend to drive sustainability forward. And so if obviously there are going to be many exceptions that apply, but if I had to look for one thing, I would try and find a business that has good, robust margins because it is most likely to be committed to sustainability for the longer term. I think that if you look at a few sectors that might be interesting, I hear actually a lot of momentum in pharma. I hear this kind of on the grapevine. I see this also anecdotally from companies that we speak with. I find that pharma is serious about sustainability. Pharma is a complex business. Pharmaceuticals obviously are, is what you kind of put in, not just, you put food into your body as well, but like with medication, it really has to work and really has to not go horribly wrong. And so pharmaceuticals tends to be a business that takes problems seriously, tries to address them robustly, tries to address them for the long term. And for various reasons, the pharmaceutical sector has really owned the sustainability challenge as one that it needs to try and address. And so I think that's a sector that has great legs for those who are looking for their next green job. I think personal care is another sector that I hear a lot of momentum in as well for similar reasons. When we speak with, for example, companies that are generating product carbon footprints and sharing them with their customers, they often tell us that the biggest pull is coming from pharma and personal care. And I think that's a nice leading signal, actually, for anyone looking for roles. Food and bev, I think, is still a sector where sustainability has momentum. But I would say that it is... It doesn't seem to me to be in the upswing of that momentum right now, if that makes sense. I think that pharma and personal care kind of, to me at least, seem to be ramping up somewhat, whereas food and beverage seems to be consolidating a little around what it's doing. So they're talking about less new stuff, and they're trying to do the stuff that they're already doing, but do it better and do it more efficiently and maybe do it at a bigger scale. These are my sort of anecdotal observations based on my network, I guess, which is maybe a few hundred companies, but take it or leave it. I would say that the same principle holds true in the B2B space. I think inherently a lot of what I've been discussing has sort of B2C vibes or consumer vibes, but I think the same principle holds true in business to business, those companies selling to other companies. I would say, relatively speaking, look for companies that have a commanding position in the supply chain and are used to the idea of partnering with customers on strategic challenges rather than simply providing goods for offtake. And what I mean by that as a distinction is, let's take a food and beverage business, right? There's the company providing you with stationery and paper and stuff for the print room and so on. If you need to switch vendors for that, you will. It's not going to disrupt your business. That's more or less a commodity. It's not a strategic partner. But let's say that you're, again, take like the Coca-Cola company or a beverage player, right? Your packaging supplier is likely to be a strategic partner for you. Your sugar supplier may well be a strategic partner for you. These are partners where your business is really reliant on this other business, not just providing you with stuff that is at quality, on time, at appropriate price, but also your business requires this business to do well and to succeed long term and to be there for you long term. And that business, that supplier, recognizes that, and together they have built this strategic partnership. And so I find that if you can find the right B2B player, which has this sort of long-term perspective matched with long-term perspectives on their customer side, and they have good margins and good IP that defend those margins, again, I think of like flavors, fragrances, some specialty ingredients, some types of packaging. These are all good examples. I think that you'll find actually sustainability is an interesting place to be in those businesses because they're seeing it as another lever to bring in to differentiate and distinguish their product and expand the market margins still further. The general rule of thumb, I think, for B2B businesses is try and move from a lower margin to a higher margin. And that progression is not always about new products or new services. Often it's about new positioning, new ways of thinking, and new strategies to really orient yourself towards a long-term partnership. I've talked a lot about that first bucket, which is the corporate bucket. And I think that bucket is the most important because that's where most of the magic happens, right? That's where all the action is. But that said, let me also try and do justice to my own tribe, which is the vendor tribe, all those trying to flog something. And so I have had a really nice bird's eye view of this tribe, not just by being in it, but this is maybe like a side note, right? But Altruistic is obviously a sustainability software solution. We provide corporate footprinting, product footprinting, supply chain engagement solutions. I hope you've heard the ad, so you know what we do. But, in this space, there used to be about 150 companies, my rough number back of the envelope, 150 companies maybe a couple of years ago. I think half of those companies are now bust. And of the, let's say, 75 companies remaining, I think 70 of them are looking to sell themselves, and the remaining 5 aren't buying anyone. And so as one of the ones that has the luxury of not looking to sell itself, we have companies coming to us and trying to be sold. And so, we've had a bunch of these. And so I feel like we have a really good view, which was developing month by month, on what the software space looks like. I've also started speaking with a range of consultancies, all the ones I could get my hands on in the sustainability space, to try and understand, how their business is. And, we're also exploring partnerships and that sort of thing. And from what I can see, is let's divide these two, actually. Let's talk about consultancies first, and then let's talk about software. On the consultancy side, consultancies were a very reliable place to go for sustainability roles, I would say 3 years ago. In fact, 3 or 4 years ago, I remember, I hope Deloitte doesn't sue me for saying this, but I didn't hear it from them. I heard it from other people, which is that Deloitte was offering people I knew at corporates ridiculous amounts of money to leave the corporate and go and join Deloitte so that Deloitte could kind of farm them out back to corporates. And I think actually Deloitte built a really good team from what I could see using that approach. And I think that other consultancies also started following suit. And then what happened is suddenly the music seemed to stop. And I think the music stopped for the big consulting players, and it's sort of like Maslow's pyramid of consultancies, where there are these 3 tiers of consultancies, like fully actualized, which are the McKinsey, Bain, BCG. And I realize that, I'm ex-McKinsey, so I'm probably a little biased. Then there's like the big 4, which is KPMG, EY, PwC, Deloitte. And then there's all the boutiques, basically, in the sustainability consulting space. So like Carbon Trust and Systemic and ERM, and there's a few I'm forgetting. Sorry to anyone I'm forgetting, but all the others. And I think actually kind of the music stopped somewhat in that order, actually. Like I kind of noticed that McKinsey had a massive sustainability practice until it didn't. And I'm like, where did all these people go? Where did all the solutions go? Why am I not hearing about these anymore on the grapevine? And I think Bain and BCG also started kind of quietly, maybe toning it down and doing other stuff. And then I think the big 4 also sort of went the same way. And suddenly this massive hiring pull that I saw happening in the consulting space sort of just quieted down a fair bit. And sadly, I think the music seemed to hit last on a lot of the boutiques. And I think part of that is because a bunch of the boutiques were bought up by private equity a few years ago on the pitch that sustainability is this massive growing wave, and actually private equity should buy these consultancies and do a massive roll-up. And just as a lot of those acquisitions were finished, like within a couple of years, you know who you are, by the way, consultancies. A couple of years after that, suddenly the music seemed to not stop, but at least slow down. And so suddenly I've been noticing this by diligently studying the public accounts of some of these consultancies, is that just there's a lot of retrenchments start to happen and a lot of downsizing start to happen. So I think the consulting kind of opportunity space has gotten a lot smaller, and I think that's a tricky place to go and join because it is so dependent right now on whether gigs are coming your way from the corporates. And every consultancy that I speak with in the sustainability space, and I speak mostly with the boutiques, tell me that it is harder and harder to get gigs. And the reason it's harder to get gigs is a lot of clients are self-serving using Gen AI stuff, ChatGPT, and a lot of the, not just basic questions, but a lot of the knowledge acquisition is now happening self-serve. A lot of stuff is being taken over by software and automated, and just the pie is smaller. So that space has just gotten a lot more competitive. And I don't think that the scale is there right now to absorb as many of the people who are looking for sustainability roles and would like those roles. Let's move on to the software side. I think software is interesting because I think that there is still good demand for software. The demand is growing. We see more requests for proposals or RFPs every year than we did the year before. We obviously do more business every year than we did before. So like the market and the demand is growing, but I don't think that it is growing as fast as the supply side, and by that I mean all the software companies and all the people funding software companies thought it would 4 or 5 years ago. Which means that right now, if you think of those 75 companies that I talked about, I kind of know who's who in those 75, but I don't expect the average person looking for a green job would know, looking at those 75, which ones are likely to be here in the next few years and which ones aren't. I'm probably being quite hubristic or conceited when I say I know. I probably don't know either, right? But I could make an educated guess on some of them. Some of them will surprise me. And I guess what I'm kind of saying is it's pretty hard to tell, really, where you want to, hitch your wagon. And so, for instance, I know that the nature space is interesting. I think the supply chain traceability space is interesting. I think that the general CSRD regulation support space is obviously, going to grow now that CSRD is upon us. But, there's a lot of noise still out there. I think it's very hard to make bets right now until the market settles a bit. And I think it'll take a couple of years for the market to settle a bit and reach a sort of equilibrium. 75 companies or more. And I don't want to say that number like it's gospel, right? I basically made it up. But 75 companies or so is probably far too much for this space. And so I think you want to wait until the market consolidates a little before you start betting on that space. The final unsung hero of the sustainability space is the nonprofit sector. We've talked corporates, we've talked vendors, we should talk nonprofits. And the reason I say unsung heroes is because we've thrown a lot of crap at them over the last few years, right? Like we have roundly criticized SBTI. I'm not just saying we as in the podcast, but like generally speaking, everyone I know has roundly criticized SBTI. I'm sorry, SBTI. I'm just, it's true. It's not me. It's just the market. I think CDP has had its fair share as well of critique. And frankly, like most of the big nonprofits, I don't think these two are even the biggest, but like most of the nonprofits in the sustainability space, I think have over the last few years have had some sort of crisis of faith from their community in some shape or form, right? It's like, what are you actually going to be doing? How do you provide value? I speak with like a lot of nonprofits that are running consortia, and those consortia are kind of now redundant, maybe because software is taking over a lot of the data stuff that these consortia worked on, or, they were in the US and they were funded by funders who have now disappeared on them. There's just a lot of this that has been happening. Interestingly enough, or perhaps controversially, I would say, I actually think that the nonprofit side is going to settle down now a little. And then I think that the worst period for the nonprofits was probably the last 2 years. I think that the new administration in the US, I think that everything that happened to USAID and ripple impacts throughout the philanthropic space, check out our podcast episode on the Gates memo if you want to explore that a bit further. But I think all those sort of ripple implications that like came of the new US administration, and they were really far-reaching ripples that I think hit pretty much every nonprofit, I don't want to say in the world, but like a very large share of the global nonprofit community would have been hit directly or indirectly or pulled into that sort of wave. And I think that a lot of that is just settling down now, actually. I think nonprofits have kind of adjusted to the new normal. They've found new funding sources. They've downsized, and they're kind of now settling in on whatever they figure their new mandates are. So I actually think that could be an interesting place to go if you find a good role. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done in this space, actually. Like the need for honest brokers, which I think is the best way to put this, who can bridge between different corporations, different stakeholder groups, corporations and government, I think that that's going to be an evergreen need. So I think that there's still going to be good roles in that space in a way that there wouldn't have been over the last couple of years. I want to add, maybe, having gone through where to look in terms of roles, having talked a little bit about anti-fragility in the job market and where the sustainability function is heading, I want to maybe add a general note on politics, which is I think that we are obviously still in the sustainability bear market. And right now, most corporations are prioritizing political risk over climate risk, as far as I can tell. And who can blame them? If you've seen the sort of all the stuff coming out of Davos, around Trump's speech and Mark Carney's speech and all the other speeches, and obviously if you've been following, Venezuela and Greenland and who knows where next, it's a turbulent time, and I think it is hard to be focused on an inherently long-term challenge when there's so much uncertainty even over the next 6 months that could really roil markets and corporates and supply chains. And so it is very understandable that corporations will have their mind space focused on something else. 4 years ago, 5 years ago, if you'd asked me, where does sustainability sit on the CEO agenda, I would have said no right-minded CEO, I think, would put it at number one, because number one should be just core stuff around running your business if you're a responsible CEO. But sustainability is probably, for most good CEOs, in the top 3 to 5 priorities. But right now, I think that 3 to 5 space is just very competitive because there's so many things happening. There's so many wild cards. You're juggling balls, and actually there's someone on the sidelines just chucking more balls at you. But I think that this will quiet down a little, and sustainability does tend to be a cyclical topic. I think we talked about this in our episode with John Elkington some months ago. But that doesn't mean that the current cycle will end on a timeline that works for you. We may be here until the midterms in the US. We may be here until 2030. And so what I would say is, if you're looking to build a career that touches largely on the sustainability space, which means either that's the core nature of your role or your role is adjacent to sustainability, then I would focus on becoming anti-fragile, building great transferable hard skills that are good in a crisis, building depth of knowledge on your business, your sector, what makes it tick, and that's going to be useful in a crisis, because the one thing we can always be sure of is there will be another crisis. Thanks for listening to this edition of the State of Sustainability podcast. If you liked the episode, hit follow so you don't miss our next show with Mikala Krishnan, partner at McKinsey, as we talk about climate risk. And if you want to help us out, please do consider leaving a review.